really want to consider is what are we trying to do with data, not just as teachers, but when we are engaging with kids. So Carol Dweck is this research guru. A lot of you might have heard of her. She kind of is pioneering the whole growth mindset idea that you can be taught to learn anything. And one of her main things she talks about is that anything that you give kids to do, it needs to challenge them in a usable way. So if you're talking about data with kids, it can't just be rote. Like, they can't just be interpreting information and naming off numbers and looking at a graph and just saying, here's where I am, and then walking away. They actually have to have some kind of actionable steps with that. So if you guys want to turn and talk, if you have any data, did anyone bring data? Okay. Just about what you might want students to do with it and what skills they actually would need in order to do that. So we'll have like maybe 2 minutes for that.
So I just read the ladders because that's kind of what we're working on right now. Here we'll get one that Quinn already has some kind of filled out with opinion pieces. And so obviously what I want students to do with it is understand what they would have to do to get to proficiency here. And then the skills that they need to do it, that's where the time really comes in, which is a little bit harder because you guys need to show them like it's understand all these things.
And it's different with
the nice thing about it was that
really young primary kids. And so some of the stuff I touch on
he knows that from his data.
Seems like it's geared a little more, but I do have some things that I've collected on how to work with younger kids on sharing those things.
Conclusion. And then that would be what they focus on the next. And I try to have this, I've been working on this year. Try to have that guide their goals for the quarter. So if they're not, they know they're not at proficiency, to think about like 2 things that they can do to improve that. And so they use the data that they have from either the network or the ladder to set goals.
Are we good to come back?
Yes.
Does anyone need more time? One of the big things I talk about when you're using data with kids and you're trying to get them to understand that, and in any task that you're getting kids, a lot of the research talks about performance orientation versus mastery orientation. And if those words aren't familiar to you, that's okay, because I'm sure once I start explaining it, the ideas are going to be familiar to you guys. Basically, it's the difference between, do you want what you give them and the feedback they're collecting and the information they're looking at, is that going to lead them into a further learning task? Do they have steps that they can take to advance their learning with what you're sharing them? Or is it just about a report? It's comparing yourself to other people's numbers. It's achieving success with little effort. So obviously, we're leaning towards this desire to have mastery orientation, which means that kids aren't getting this baseline and then beating it and then being comfortable with moving on past that. They're actually trying to work towards a mastery of a specific skill, and those goals have to be individualized. So, mastery orientation in practice, when students are using data and they have a mastery orientation, they should be the ones interpreting information. They should be the ones setting goals. They should understand why the data is significant, and they should be able to articulate their next steps. Now, we have a big variety of teachers here. So for a kindergarten student, that's going to look a lot different than for a 5th grade student. I know that some of our upper level teams are using proficiency ladders, and you can have a whole conversation with kids on where are you at on this ladder, what's your next step, how are you proceeding through this. For a kindergarten student, when I start this at the beginning of the year, it may simply just be talking about a whole class-wide goal. What are we all trying to do together? What are we all working towards? And having that group model, because you're teaching academic skills, but the beginning of the year is so much about social skills too, that you may not be able to individualize it down to each kid that may be an end of the year, just starting to get into it type task. And that's completely okay. And I think when people think about data, a lot of times they're thinking about assessment results, tests, numbers, information like that. But we can be talking about anything. Behavior data, so a behavior goal you have for your class, and how each person might be reaching it, and then you can integrate that into some type of graphing activity or anything like that. The big thing is that I really have researched and seen that when kids, either individually or in groups, are the ones setting goals around that data, it matters more to them. When it's just something we're bringing to the table and wanting to talk about, then they kind of could care less.
I love it, but they should be the ones interpreting information. I think sometimes that's where like some of my students fall down a little bit, is because they know essentially what they should be doing, but they can't necessarily articulate why they need to do that. You know, I have kids turn in essays all the time, and they're like, I know it's a 4th grade proficient essay, and it's not. So, in your research, did you find anything for if they're misinterpreting their own information? Because I think kids do that.
Yeah, we're going to get down the road a little bit on that, which is a great question. One of the big things is that mastery is determined by the teacher. So if the teacher can establish mastery and either come up with real student examples that can be compared for the students, or create examples if you have a whole class that's struggling towards mastery or something, then that information is right there for the kids. So what are we working towards? This is what mastery looks like, okay? So if you are not producing this level, then you still are working on it, and then you can work backwards from there to where are we at so that you can set a really achievable goal. Sometimes I feel like kids are like this with data. So protocols to use with kids, just so that they're not overwhelmed. They should be able to get a sense of improvement from any data that you're sharing with them. So if data is an island, we have this, and then 6 months later we maybe talk about the same thing and we've tracked nothing in between, then it's really hard for kids to connect that because it's super abstract. Even if we can see, well, this was the beginning of the year reading fluency and this is your middle of the year reading fluency, if they haven't seen any information in between those periods that connect with that skill, then it's really abstract for them and they have no idea why you're talking about it. So they need a sense of improvement. Their goals need to be achievable, but not so achievable that they're not challenging, which I'll show you in the next slide. Progress monitored. So that's where you as a teacher have action steps where, depending on the level of your kids, you can either engage them in teaching those processes to progress monitor themselves. If that's not appropriate for their cognitive level, then you might have to figure out a system that works for you. Mastery focused, so we're working on a process and we're all in this continuum, right? We're not checking lists and then being done with the skill. We're building on a process, so having kids understand where they're starting and where they're at along that continuum and what their next steps can be. And then it needs to be referenced often. And progress monitored and referenced often sound like the same thing, but progress monitoring is more about them checking in with specific skills, formative assessment type things. Referenced often is more about a conversation you're having, okay? So where are you at? How do you feel about your progress towards this? Goals are achievable when people know their baseline goals and where they think they are, what their grade level says they are, should not establish their goal. Where they actually are, and that again, for kindergarten or 1st grade, looks a lot more like checking a class on a whole set of skills and you have no idea where kids are coming in often at the beginning of the year. In the upper grades, you have those really heavy hitter kids, those kids that you know are going to have struggles right at the beginning of the year. but you still need to understand where each kid is as a whole, and they can participate a lot in providing you with that information. So when I talked about achievable goals, they shouldn't be so achievable that they've already achieved it, like when class starts. And that's that differentiation piece where certain kids are going to get things really fast. And as teachers, we need to be ready to have those discussions about what's the next step, what does application look like of this skill in real life. So maybe take 2 minutes to talk about practices that have helped you set goals around data, and then we can talk as a group.
What's going on their page. I've never tried any of those strategic goals, have you?
You can explore letters, because I have set more times for letters that you guys are such a great, because they don't do it.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes it's like what hasn't worked is really is almost retailing classes as writers, which is why I didn't do anything. I didn't set them until the quarter one writing, because then I had a writing section that I knew was full, and I can see where kids were at, and then the kids that weren't really on grade ones, because they obviously a goal proficient that first.
Yeah, when I was teaching
Great.
second grade, I had to make my goals
And
really
then
close,
the rest of the
like,
quarter writing
time-wise,
examples.
by Thursday. And then because of that, they also had to be really narrow and concrete, and like, this is something we can make progress on in 4 days. You know, those big overarching goals with younger kids aren't appropriate in most cases.
I want them to be writing stuff that's like more.
So we definitely do this for sure, right?
And
Yeah.
I want to use that for their letters, but I want the environment from you, like not the. So we kind of ran into something like that, but
I'm gonna move it right here.
I think it's been nice for the kids who are fast, like they get it really fast.
So, I just want to give, because this is tied to data, small tangents on feedback. I also have a few other things we can talk about, but I've been considering my feedback practice a lot lately with kids, and I think that it's easier to get through feedback when we're looking at it really surface level. This is what you got, this is where you're at, hand and back of paper. And that works for certain things. Certainly there's things that you're just checking a baseline, right? So fluency, performance, you read this many words in a minute, and you can give them that information. But when kids have a score on each thing right away, almost all the research on that overwhelmingly will say that's the only piece of data they're going to look at. And if you spent time writing comments or asking them to have a peer conference, or even if you sit down in conference with them, they're not hearing you because they already know what score they got and they've settled that in their mind as finished. So these are just some different ways that I've been thinking through to provide feedback. They definitely lend themselves a little bit more to older kids, but I want the feedback that I'm taking the time to give kids to be usable, because that's data that they're receiving from me that they should be able to act on. So a few things that I've been toying with is the idea of first giving the kids their written feedback. I've written all over certain things, and then the rubric of expectations that they've had to work off of all along, and then have them rate themselves on that rubric and read my feedback to rate themselves, and then come talk with me about, okay, this is why I think I'm here based on what you said here, here, and here, and then we have that conversation. If they're totally off, that gives a great point for me to talk about mastery. If they're right on, it helps me to see that they're understanding their goal really well. Feedback scavenger hunts is one thing that I saw as an idea.